So I wanted to show you today this interesting texture. Hope you can see it. You can use this on paper, or as you can see here, I've actually used it on a stretched canvas. You can see these lovely little raised marks, but you could use it in a landscape. Imagine that as sort of the branches between trees, or you could use it for rocks, or whatever your imagination says. It's really two ways of creating such a background. You could use something like this. This is Quor cold press ground, and it's really thick and squidgy, sort of quite granular to look at, and you could put that on with a palette knife and create ridges and dents. So that would be number one way. But something that I've been doing is using tissue paper, and that's what I want to show you today. So to make this texture, what we need is our canvas, or indeed a good strong piece of watercolour paper, some acid-free tissue paper, and by tissue paper I mean the stuff that you'd wrap a present in, not toilet paper. You need some PVA glue. You could use something like Mod Podge, or just craft glue, or school glue. Doesn't really matter, because the tissue paper is so thin, it doesn't need something super strong. You need a large brush. Something I haven't written on here, obviously a container to put things on, and eventually you'll need the watercolour ground, but I'll bring you on to that in a moment. Oh, I'm going to use the school glue. Just need to decant enough glue to cover your surface and slightly water it down, maybe 10-15%, not much, and then just sort of mix it up so it is diluted. This is just to help spreadability and make sure you get some nice crinkles in that tissue paper. Maybe a little bit more. So before you start sticking your paper down, have a little think. Where do you want the crinkles and the texture to go? Do you want them to be horizontal? Do you want them to be vertical? Do you want them to be very random, or have a repetition to them? Because you can control that. Then, when you know what you want to do, simply a case of applying the PVA to your surface. Do be generous. You can't see all the surface here because my canvas is too big for the camera. You do need to think about edges too. And then you start laying your tissue down. Now I want quite a random look. If there are marks from where it's been folded, don't worry, those will just disappear. Be aware that as soon as it gets wet, it gets very fragile. And then you just need to stick it. Can you start to see that you get these really interesting marks, but you want them all stuck down? If you looked and thought, oh, I don't like that, and decided to take the paper off and start again, you would just get such a mess, because it will just rip. So be careful, stick it down, and then don't fiddle. Right, that needs to dry, and we'll come back when that's dry and we'll put the watercolour ground over the top. Right, everything's dry now. We've got some really lovely patterns and creases in the tissue paper. You need to let it dry because the tissue paper is really vulnerable while it's damp, and even the putting a roller over the top, which is what we're going to do the next, would potentially tear it. It's a good idea, see if I can show you this, if you've got surplus paper at the edges, just to rip it off at this point. If bits of it actually rip off the canvas, don't worry, because that sort of edge is going to get disguised by the watercolour ground, so it's not an issue, but better to do it now than to do it right at the end. Okay, so let's put that down there. Next we've got to think about putting some watercolour ground on top. Watercolour ground basically is slightly absorbent and makes your surface behave more like paper. Now if you've stuck your tissue paper onto ordinary watercolour paper, you may not need to do this. Have a little experiment and work it out. But on canvas you definitely do. Schminker, Daniel Smith's and Quor all make watercolour grounds. Daniel Smith's makes various colours, white, this sort of beigey colour, black, a sparkly one. You can tint grounds if you want to. I don't see much point of having a coloured ground for the way I work. I like watercolour on a white ground. Select your ground, whatever you've got, and then I like to put mine on with a roller, and it's a simple case, just as you would a wall, is put the watercolour ground over the top in a thin, even layer. You need to let this layer dry, give it a couple of hours, then do it again, and then do it again. 3 thin layers is what I would certainly recommend. Some of the manufacturers, I think Daniel Smith says you can get away with 1. I've tried it and I don't think you can. When you've got that 3rd layer on, let it cure overnight and then your canvas is ready to paint on. And it's as simple as that. You can then paint whatever subject you like, and at the end you need to seal it to protect your work, or indeed frame it under glass if you're on paper, but you've got this wonderful background to take your watercolours to a new dimension.